The plane, preparing to land, fell into an unprecedented crisis. The engine throttles were stuck, and the aircraft was completely unable to decelerate. The two pilots in the cockpit faced an unprecedented predicament. The plane was like a heavy truck going downhill, with failed brakes, rushing towards the runway at high speed. The lives of the 322 people on board hung by a thread, and the reason behind it was beyond imagination. Hello everyone, I am Test. Today, I will tell you about the perilous true event of CATHAY Pacific Flight 780, a flight fraught with danger. On April 13, 2010, an AIRBUS A330 was parked at Bay 8 of Wanda International Airport in Surabaya, Indonesia, preparing to refuel. About an hour later, this aircraft would operate CATHAY Pacific Flight 780, carrying 309 passengers and 13 crew members, to Hong Kong. The refueler on the apron connected the vehicle's hoses to the ground hydrant, and the aircraft. The fuel truck began to pump fuel from the underground pipelines directly into the aircraft's fuel tanks. For long-haul flights, aircraft need to carry a large amount of fuel, and traditional tanker trucks carry limited fuel. With low efficiency, the apron hydrant refueling method ensures safety and saves aircraft refueling time. While this aircraft was refueling, the refueling hose vibrated multiple times. The refueler didn't pay much attention, because this had been happening frequently lately. Every time it vibrated, he would pause the refueling for a moment, and then continue. But this situation was precisely the danger signal that led to the problems on CATHAY Pacific Flight 780. After the aircraft took on 24.4 tons of fuel at Surabaya Airport, CATHAY Flight 780 began boarding. At that time, 35-year-old Captain Malcolm Waters served as the pilot monitoring for this flight. This captain had a total flight time exceeding 7,000 hours and had worked at CATHAY Pacific for 12 years. Partnering with him was 37-year-old First Officer David Hayhoe. Before joining CATHAY Pacific, this pilot had served in the Royal Australian Air Force for 11 years. He would serve as the pilot flying for this mission, responsible for flying the aircraft. CATHAY Flight 780 entered runway 28 at Surabaya Airport at 8:24 local time. First Officer David Hayhoe slowly pushed the throttle forward. The two Rolls-Royce Trent 700 engines, after emitting their signature buzz, began to push the 198-ton aircraft to accelerate for takeoff. Less than half a minute later, the plane gracefully left the runway. Flight 780 embarked on its journey to Hong Kong. Not long after takeoff, Captain Malcolm noticed that the engine pressure ratio (EPR) of the number to engine was showing some abnormal fluctuations. Immediately after, the number 1 engine also exhibited the same issue. Engine pressure ratio (EPR) is the ratio of the engine exhaust pressure to the intake pressure. Simply put, it reflects the magnitude of the engine's thrust. The higher the ratio, the greater the thrust. The lower the ratio, the smaller the thrust. This abnormal fluctuation in value indicated that there was likely a problem with the engines. Just after the aircraft climbed to a cruising altitude of 39,000 feet, 2 ECAM alert messages suddenly popped up on the screen, warning the pilots of an anomaly in the number-to-engine control system, and that engine response had slowed down. The captain immediately contacted the engineers at CATHAY Pacific's Integrated Operations Center via satellite comms to seek assistance, since all other values of the 2 engines were completely normal, with only the EPR fluctuating around the target value. And there were many possibilities that could cause this. The engineer suggested the crew continue the flight. The crew used the thrust levers to test the response of both engines. The results showed that, apart from slight EPR fluctuations, there were no other anomalies. So, they accepted the engineer's advice and decided to continue to Hong Kong. After 2 hours of flight, CATHAY Flight 780 left Malaysian airspace. Upon the request of Singapore ATC, the aircraft descended to 38,000 feet to cruise. Just as they began level flight at the new cruising altitude, ECAM alert messages popped up on the screen again. In addition to the previous two, this time there was an additional prompt. To avoid rapid thrust changes. With a "let's try it" attitude, the captain turned on the engine, anti-ice. But this did not solve the problem. So they contacted the headquarters engineers again. After investigation, the engineer told the crew that the EPR fluctuations in the number 1 engine might be due to the FADEC, using the number 1 engine to compensate for the EPR fluctuations of the number 2 engine. The new alert message that popped up was likely caused by a malfunction of the engine's internal variable stator vanes. The engineer advised the crew to carefully monitor engine parameters further and handle the thrust levers with care. When controlling the engines, once the plane arrived, they would replace the fuel metering unit of that engine. After understanding the situation, the crew decided to continue to Hong Kong. Although the engineer accurately diagnosed the stator vane fault, he certainly could not have imagined that the root cause of this failure was hidden in a seemingly ordinary natural event. And this starts with a heavy rainstorm that Surabaya Airport encountered some time ago. A month before this flight departed, Surabaya Airport was undergoing apron expansion work. Before laying concrete for the new apron, the welding of the fuel supply pipes for the hydrant refueling system needed to be completed. Since the airport is very close to the coast, a new regulating reservoir was designed and built to prevent accumulated water from affecting flight safety during rain. During the welding work, the airport encountered several days of continuous heavy rain. Seawater from the regulating reservoir seeped into the welding construction area. Because of this, the entire underground fuel supply pipeline needed to be flushed to prevent the salt in the seawater from contaminating the entire pipeline refueling system. 4 days before Flight 780 departed, the pipelines for Bays 1-10 completed their first flush. The Indonesian State Oil Company tested fuel samples. During the flushing process, the results met standards for use. So, hydrant refueling was restored for Bays 5-10. However, the Technical Department of Indonesian Civil Aviation did not conduct an acceptance inspection of the entire project at this time. In fact, the seawater in the pipelines had not been completely cleared. The fuel dispenser truck connecting the hydrant and the aircraft, besides its refueling function, has another very important function: to remove water from the fuel. Superabsorbent polymer SAP, the main material in diapers, is also installed on the refueling truck as a material to remove residual water from aviation kerosene. If it were ordinary freshwater contamination, it would be manageable. But in the case of seawater contamination, the SAP reacts with the salt in the seawater, causing the filter monitor to slowly deform under pressure. The restricted fuel flow created the abnormal vibrations mentioned earlier. These SAP beads that had absorbed salt, due to the damage to the filter, were pumped along with the fuel into the aircraft's fuel tanks. Generally speaking, the fuel filter inside the engine can capture all contaminants larger than 40 microns, and about 90% of contaminants between 10-40 microns. But these SAP beads that entered the fuel tank were extremely fine. These particles, visible only under a microscope, possessed powerful destructive power. They affected the operation of the engines, variable stator vanes, and multiple components responsible for fuel control. A situation far more dangerous than the EPR fluctuations was quietly brewing inside the engines. After another hour and a half of flight, CATHAY Flight 780 was about to enter the Hong Kong Flight Information Region. Although visibility at Chek Lap Kok Airport was good, the runway for landing was likely to experience wind shear. The crew completed the approach briefing, following normal procedures, and the plane began to descend slowly. Except for the engine, we are still fluctuating. Everything else was normal. Just as the plane descended to 30,000 feet, the two pilots in the cockpit heard a slight banging sound. Then they smelled ozone and a burning odor. Immediately after, two warnings popped up on the ECAM. They were, number 1 engine control system fault, and number 2 engine stall. The turbine blades inside the engine are designed very similarly to airplane wings, so these blades can also stall due to airflow separation. When the compressor stalls, the combustion chamber cannot receive normal compressed air. For combustion, the engine will experience thrust loss, abnormal vibrations, and in severe cases, engine surge. This is extremely dangerous for flight. So, upon receiving the warning messages, the crew took immediate action. Following the procedural requirements, they adjusted the number 2 engine to idle, and then set the number 1 engine to the maximum continuous thrust position to compensate for the thrust lost by the number 2 engine. But not long after, 2 more caution messages appeared on the ECAM. At the same time, the in-1 speed of the number 1 engine dropped from 57% to about 37%. Clearly, both engines were having problems. The crew immediately issued a pan-pan call, which is 1 level lower than a mayday. Hong Kong, CATHAY 780, pan-pan. Pan-pan, pan-pan. We are operating at engine 2 at idle thrust at the moment. But operations normal apart from that, and just require elevated response level of it. Thanks. CATHAY 780, roger your pan. After the controller received the emergency report, the crew immediately began the single engine failure approach and landing procedure briefing. The captain, as pilot flying, took over the controls of the aircraft. However, troubles came one after another, just as the plane descended to 8,000 feet. Another warning popped up on the ECAM. When the 2 pilots saw this warning, they gasped in shock. Engine number 1 also stalled. After setting the number 1 engine to idle thrust, as required, Captain Malcolm used the thrust levers to test both engines, one by one. Something desperate began to happen. The engines had absolutely no response to the pilot's throttle inputs. At the current altitude and airspeed, they could only glide for a distance of about 38 nautical miles. The airport that seemed close at hand suddenly became a destination difficult for the 322 people to reach safely. Facing this sudden crisis, the crew quickly upgraded the emergency report from pan-pan to the highest level, Mayday. Approach, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. CATHAY 780 had an engine 1 and engine 2 stall. Currently, we require a lower descent, maintaining 8,000. CATHAY 780, descent to 3,000 feet. The culprit behind this crisis was the sap beads inside the fuel tanks. Initially, these particles only interfered with the normal operation of the variable stator vanes. But after a long flight, they gradually affected the engine's internal fuel main metering valve. These particles accumulated in the valve, which has a structure similar to a car engine cylinder, causing the piston controlling fuel flow to respond slowly, or even jam completely. This was why, when the captain used the thrust levers to increase thrust, the engines did not respond. At 13:32, Captain Malcolm disconnected the autopilot and turned off the flight directors. Then he started to climb to gain a little altitude. This also allowed the aircraft to decelerate to green dot speed, allowing the aircraft to obtain the best lift-to-drag ratio in a clean configuration. But even so, if the engine still could not provide thrust, they would be unable to land on the runway. If no measures were taken, the plane would have to ditch in the sea. And this type of ditching is extremely dangerous in rough seas. During the aircraft's deceleration, the first officer turned on the auxiliary power unit APU. The engine start switches were also set to the ignition position. This way, the engine internals would receive continuous ignition, preventing a dual engine failure as much as possible. Captain Malcolm, with a "let's try it" attitude, moved the number 1 engine thrust lever again. But the engine didn't respond at all. However, he did not get discouraged. After multiple slight adjustments, the number 1 engine surprisingly came back to life. The engine's N1 speed rose to 74% as the thrust lever was increased. For the crew, this was undoubtedly excellent news. Although the number 2 engine remained at idle, the thrust provided by the number 1 engine was finally enough to let them land on the runway. After solving the number 1 engine problem, the first officer suggested to the captain to attempt to restart the number 2 engine. Following the checklist, they manually deployed the ram air turbine rat, started APU bleed air, turned it off, and then turned the number 2 engine master switch back on. But the number 2 engine could still only maintain idle status. Although this procedure was not applicable to the current situation, the crew's ability to break convention under high stress and calmly attempt to solve the problem fully demonstrated their professional competence and adaptability in the face of danger. At 13:38, the plane reached a position 9 nautical miles south of the airport. After the crew set the flaps to config 1, the aircraft needed to continue decelerating and descending. To prepare for landing, the captain slowly pulled the thrust lever back to the idle position. However, a suffocating scene played out again. The engine did not respond. The thrust did not decrease at all. Having just escaped the crisis of ditching at sea, the crew was now trapped in the predicament of a stuck engine throttle. At this moment, the plane was like a heavy truck going downhill with failed brakes. The engine that was fixed with great difficulty had now become a fatal problem. At 8 nautical miles from the runway, the aircraft was still descending rapidly at 234 knots. From an altitude of over 5,000 feet, far exceeding the normal approach speed, the crew decisively deployed the speed brakes and lowered the landing gear, trying to slow the plane down. But this drag was not enough at all. Driven by the engine, the plane continued to accelerate downwards to extend the flight distance as much as possible for deceleration. After flying over the runway centerline, the plane maneuvered to align with the runway. But at this time, the aircraft's airspeed was still 100 knots faster than the normal landing speed. When at over 900 feet above the ground, although the plane was still overspeeding, the captain retracted the speed brakes as per regulations. The ground proximity warning system piercing alarm sounded amidst the jarring noise. If they chose to go around, the aircraft with partial thrust loss might not be able to climb safely. How long the engine would last was also unknown. The captain had no choice but to bite the bullet and continue landing. At 1 nautical mile from the runway, the first officer set the flaps to config 2. Because the airspeed exceeded the flaps to limit speed, the flaps only extended halfway. Even so, this was the only deceleration measure the crew could take. In the air, accompanied by constant warning sounds, the captain concentrated entirely on controlling this colossal machine, overspeeding by 100 knots, finally touching down 680 meters past the runway threshold. Due to excessive speed, as soon as the right landing gear touched the runway, the plane bounced. Under the combined effect of the impact force and the right crosswind, the plane rotated to the left. The captain quickly pushed the stick forward to prevent the plane from bouncing again. But this action caused the nose to pitch down rapidly, and the number 1 engine struck the runway. Nevertheless, the captain's decisive handling kept the plane on the runway. The spoilers automatically deployed, rapidly dumping lift. The captain engaged reverse thrust and applied full brakes. But only the left engine reverser unlocked successfully. As the plane raced down the runway, The captain fought hard with the rudder to counteract the yaw caused by the single reverser. After rolling for 2,630 meters, Cathay Flight 780 finally stopped just 300 meters from the end of the runway. The captain immediately shut down both engines and assessed the evacuation situation with the first officer. At this time, the brake temperature had soared to an astonishing 995 degrees Celsius. Firefighters reported tires and brakes on fire. The captain decisively ordered an emergency evacuation because some passengers carried luggage. During the emergency evacuation, the entire evacuation process took 2 minutes and 15 seconds to complete. Of the 322 people on board, 62 passengers suffered minor injuries during the evacuation. One passenger was sent to the hospital for surgery due to a fractured ankle. After 3 years of in-depth investigation, the Civil Aviation Department of Hong Kong SAR released the investigation report on this accident. When inspecting the engine fuel main metering valve, investigators discovered sap beads accumulated inside. After multiple experiments and studies, they concluded that negligence by Indonesian aviation authorities led to the fuel at Surabaya airport being contaminated by seawater. The salt in the fuel destroyed the refueling truck's filter monitors. Sap beads were pumped into this aircraft. These seemingly tiny particles accumulated over time, clogging the main metering valve of the number 1 engine, preventing the piston from moving normally. The variable stator vanes of the number 2 engine were also completely jammed by these sap beads, thus triggering the fatal crisis of thrust loss in both engines. After the investigation report was released, the refueling truck's fuel filter was redesigned to ensure that sap beads can never enter aircraft fuel tanks under any circumstances. Airbus also added new procedures to the flight manual to help pilots better identify fuel contamination, preventing trouble before it happens. Although the emergency evacuation process was not perfect, every decision and maneuver by the crew successfully turned danger into safety. With calmness and professionalism, they managed to land this unstoppable plane safely. The 2 pilots who saved this plane, Captain Malcolm Waters and First Officer David Hayhoe, relied on their outstanding performance. In July 2014, they were awarded the Polaris Award by the International Federation of Airline Pilots Associations. This honor is not only a recognition of their exquisite flying skills, but also the highest praise for their courage and professional spirit in the face of danger.